Karoline Leavitt checked her watch for the fifth time in 10 minutes. She had arrived at the television studio 2 hours early, wanting plenty of time to prepare for what might be the most important interview of her career. The green room felt too small, too warm, and the coffee they had given her tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since morning. But these small discomforts were the least of her worries. At 26, Karoline was the youngest press secretary to serve in her position, a fact that many people liked to point out whenever they wanted to question her qualifications. Tonight, she would be facing Jon Stewart, a man who had been mastering the art of political interviews since before she was born. The stakes couldn't be higher. 15 minutes, Ms. Leavitt, said a production assistant named Greg who poked his head through the door. Greg couldn't have been much older than she was, but he had that typical New York media look, slightly disheveled, but somehow still put together, with dark-rimmed glasses and a clipboard he clutched like it contained state secrets. Thank you, Greg, and please call me Karoline. Greg nodded but didn't smile. Karoline guessed he wasn't a fan of her politics. That was fine. She wasn't here to make friends. She opened her leather portfolio one more time, reviewing her notes and the key points she needed to make. Her boss had been skeptical about her accepting this invitation. It's a trap, he had warned her. Stewart will chew you up and spit you out for his audience's entertainment. But Karoline had insisted. If we only speak to friendly audiences, we're just preaching to the choir, she had argued. Besides, I've done my homework. And she had. For 3 weeks, Karoline had watched every political interview Jon Stewart had conducted over the past 5 years. She had studied his patterns, his favorite tactics, the way he used humor to disarm his guests before going for the jugular. She had prepared responses for every likely angle of attack, backed by facts and figures she had memorized until they became second nature. In the corner of the green room, the television was tuned to the show already in progress. Jon was doing his opening monologue, and the audience was laughing heartily at jokes about recent political missteps, many of them made by people Karoline worked with. She didn't turn it off. Better to know the mood he was setting before she walked out there. Her phone buzzed with a text from her media coach, Diane. Remember, he wants you to get defensive. Don't take the bait. Karoline texted back a thumbs-up emoji. Diane had been invaluable in her preparation, even playing the role of Stewart in their mock interviews, pushing Karoline until she nearly broke, then teaching her how to reset and refocus. A knock on the door, firmer this time. A woman with a headset and a clipboard, apparently everyone in television carried clipboards, stepped inside. I'm Susan, the floor manager. We're ready for you, Ms. Leavitt. I'll take you, to the stage. Karoline stood, smoothed her navy blue dress, and took a deep breath. Lead the way, Susan. The walk to the stage felt like a march to the gallows. They passed walls lined with photos of previous hosts and famous guests. The studio was larger than it appeared on television, and colder too. Karoline was glad. She had chosen a long-sleeved outfit despite the warm May weather outside. The audience came into view, a sea of faces mostly in their 20s and 30s. The demographic that had grown up watching Stewart and taking their political cues from his nightly commentaries. They applauded as she entered, but it was polite rather than enthusiastic. She could feel their curiosity, their skepticism, maybe even their hostility. Jon Stewart stood from behind his desk, buttoning his suit jacket as he walked around to greet her. Up close, he looked older than on screen, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair grayer. But his smile was warm and seemed genuine as he shook her hand. Karoline, thanks for coming on. Brave of you, he said, his voice low enough that the microphones wouldn't pick it up. Thanks for having me, Jon. I've been looking forward to it, she replied with more confidence than she felt. They took their seats, and Karoline noticed the slight height difference in the chairs. Hers was just a bit lower than his, a subtle power play that she had been warned about by Sam, a former guest on the show who now worked on her communications team. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Jon turned to face it. Our guest tonight has become one of the most recognizable faces in Washington, despite, or perhaps because of, being the youngest press secretary to ever hold the position. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt. The audience applauded again, slightly warmer now that Stewart had welcomed her. Karoline smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. So, Karoline, you're 26 years old, holding a position that traditionally goes to people with decades of experience. How did that happen? Did you win some kind of contest? Jon's first question came with a grin, a softball meant to ease them into the conversation. Well, Jon, if it was a contest, the prize is certainly unique. Long hours, high stress, and the joy of being questioned by some of the best minds in journalism, and also some regular journalists. Her gentle jab got a laugh from both Stewart and the audience. Good start. But seriously, she continued, I worked on my first political campaign when I was in college. I believed in the message, worked harder than anyone expected me to, and kept getting opportunities to prove myself. When this position opened up, I had already spent years preparing for it, even if I didn't know that's what I was doing. Jon nodded, seeming genuinely interested. That's impressive, though some might say, and by some I mean me right now, that your rapid rise has more to do with your skill at defending the indefensible than with any particular qualification. And there it was, the first real attack, wrapped in humor, but with a sharp edge. The audience chuckled, eager for blood in the water. Karoline had practiced for this exact moment. Don't get defensive. Don't show anger. Engage. Don't retreat. That's an interesting perspective, Jon. I think what you're really asking is whether I believe in what I'm saying or if I'm just good at saying it. The answer is both. I wouldn't defend policies I didn't believe in, but I also wouldn't be effective at my job if I couldn't articulate why those policies make sense, especially when speaking to people who might not share my viewpoint. Like right now. She smiled to soften her words. Jon leaned forward, sensing a worthy opponent. Fair enough. Let's talk about some of those policies then. Last month, your boss stated that the new economic plan would benefit all Americans equally. Yet independent analysis suggests that the top income brackets would receive significantly more benefit. How do you square those two statements? Karoline knew this topic would come up. She had the facts ready. I appreciate you bringing this up, Jon, because there's been some confusion about this. The phrase, benefit all Americans equally, referred to the opportunity for growth, not the dollar amount of tax relief. When we look at percentage of income rather than raw numbers, the benefits are actually quite proportional across income levels, and more importantly, the projected job creation. Whoa, Jon interrupted, holding up his hands. Let me stop you there. Are you saying that when most Americans hear equal benefits, they should automatically think in terms of proportional percentages rather than actual money in their pockets? The audience murmured in agreement with his point. This was where most guests would stumble, caught in what appeared to be political doublespeak. Behind the cameras, Karoline could see Susan making a gesture indicating they were approaching the first commercial break. She had only seconds to respond, and she needed to make it count. Jon, when you fill up your car with gas, do you think about the total cost or the price per gallon? Both matter, right? That's why we talk about both the percentage benefits and the actual dollar amounts in our complete policy briefings. I'd be happy to go through those numbers with you after the break if you're interested in the complete picture, rather than just the sound bites. Jon's eyebrows raised slightly, surprised by her response. As the music signaling the commercial break began to play, he leaned back in his chair and gave her an appraising look. We'll do exactly that when we come back, he said to the camera. As soon as the red light went off, he turned to Karoline. Not bad, Ms. Leavitt. Not bad at all. Karoline allowed herself a small smile. The real battle was just beginning, but she had survived the first round. During the break, she took a sip of water and prepared for what was coming next. Jon Stewart was regrouping too, she could tell. He was flipping through his notes, probably looking for a different angle of attack. Game on, she thought, game on. The red light on the camera blinked back on. Karoline sat up straighter, crossing her ankles beneath her chair. The commercial break had lasted only 3 minutes, but it felt much longer. A makeup artist had rushed in to powder Jon's forehead and offer Karoline a touch-up, which she had politely declined. She didn't want to appear too managed or produced. Welcome back, Jon said to the camera. We're here with Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who was just about to explain to us why we should focus on percentages instead of actual dollars when it comes to the new economic plan. Karoline noticed the slight twist he had put on her words. This was a common tactic, reframing what she had said to make it sound more extreme or unreasonable. She had seen him do this to guests who weren't prepared, and they often spent their entire segment trying to dig themselves out of a hole. Actually, Jon, I was suggesting we look at both. Let me give you a concrete example. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. May I? Jon looked slightly surprised but nodded. Guests rarely brought props. These are the actual numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, not our office's projections. She handed the paper to Jon. If you look at the middle column, you'll see that a family making $50,000 a year will save about $1,500 annually under this plan. A family making $500,000 will save about $15,000. So yes, the raw numbers are different. Jon studied the paper, looking for the catch. So the wealthy family saves 10 times as much. That doesn't sound very equal to me. The audience murmured in agreement. Karoline had expected this. Keep looking at the chart, Jon. Both families are saving exactly 3% of their income. That's what we mean by equal treatment. The same percentage relief across income levels. But there's more to it than just tax savings. She paused, making sure she had the audience's attention before continuing. The plan also includes funding for job training programs focused on areas with high unemployment, expansion of rural broadband to create more remote work opportunities, and small business loans targeted at first-generation entrepreneurs. These programs disproportionately benefit lower and middle-income Americans. Jon set the paper down. That sounds good on paper, pun intended, but history suggests these kinds of trickle-down approaches don't actually deliver for everyday Americans. The wealth gap has only widened over the past 20 years despite similar promises from both parties. The audience applauded. This was clearly a sentiment they shared. Karoline nodded, acknowledging the point rather than dismissing it. You're right that previous approaches haven't closed the wealth gap, and that's a fair criticism. That's exactly why this plan is structured differently. We're not just cutting taxes and hoping for the best. We're making targeted investments in the foundations of economic mobility, education, infrastructure, and entrepreneurship. She leaned forward slightly. But I think there's a more important question here, Jon. Do we want equal outcomes or equal opportunities? Our goal is to create a system where everyone has a fair shot, not where everyone gets the same result regardless of their choices or efforts. Jon seized on this. The equal opportunity argument. But how can opportunities be equal when some kids are born into families that can afford to send them to private schools, pay for college, provide health care, while others are wondering where their next meal is coming from? The audience erupted in applause. Jon had struck a chord, framing the issue as one of basic fairness, something his viewers cared deeply about. Susan, the floor manager, made a subtle gesture from beside the camera. They were running longer on this segment than planned. Karoline needed to be concise. That's precisely why the plan includes expanded funding for school lunch programs, community college grants, and preventative health care initiatives. Karoline replied calmly. We can acknowledge systemic inequalities while still believing in the importance of personal responsibility. Both things can be true at once. Jon raised an eyebrow. That's actually a reasonable position. He seemed genuinely surprised, which got a laugh from the audience. But let's move on to another topic where I suspect we'll find less common ground. He shuffled his notes, then looked up with a more serious expression. Last week, your boss made comments about climate change that many scientists have called dangerously misleading. Specifically, he suggested that warming might be beneficial for certain agricultural regions. How do you defend that position when it contradicts the overwhelming scientific consensus? This was a pivot to a different topic, a technique Jon often used when a line of questioning wasn't yielding the results he wanted. Karoline had prepared for this too, but she decided to try something different. Before I answer that, Jon, I'd like to ask you a question, if that's okay. Jon looked surprised again. Guests rarely took control of the interview like this. Sure. Though I should remind you who's hosting this show. The audience laughed. Fair enough, Karoline smiled. In 2019, you did an interview where you said, and I quote, "We need to be careful not to turn climate science into a religion where questioning any aspect of it makes you a heretic." Do you still believe that? A murmur went through the audience. Jon's eyes widened slightly. She had clearly caught him off guard. I did say that, yes. In the context of a broader discussion about how to effectively communicate climate science to skeptics. Exactly, Karoline nodded. Context matters. My boss was specifically talking about how warming might extend growing seasons in certain northern latitudes, which is actually supported by research. He immediately followed that by saying, this doesn't offset the overwhelmingly negative impacts of climate change globally, and that we need to continue reducing emissions while also preparing for adaptation. She pulled out her phone. Would you like me to play the full clip? I have it right here. Jon glanced at his producer, who was watching with a mixture of concern and fascination from the side of the stage. This was not how these interviews usually went. That won't be necessary, Jon said, recovering quickly. But I appreciate your thoroughness. Let's assume the quote was taken out of context. The larger issue remains. Your administration has rolled back several key environmental regulations. How does that square with acknowledging the reality of climate change? Karoline put her phone away. That's a fair question. The rollbacks were specifically targeted at regulations that our analysis showed were ineffective or created excessive compliance burdens without corresponding environmental benefits. At the same time, we've increased funding for renewable energy research by 15% and implemented new incentives for carbon capture technology. Jon looked skeptical, but independent environmental groups universally condemned those rollbacks. Not universally, Karoline corrected him gently. The River Conservation Alliance actually supported our reforms to the permitting process because they streamlined restoration projects, and the Green Energy Coalition praised our updated tax incentives for wind and solar. She was careful not to sound defensive or combative. Her tone remained conversational, as if they were just two people trying to understand a complex issue. A producer was now frantically signaling to Jon from off stage. They needed to go to commercial again. We need to take another break, Jon said, sounding slightly relieved. When we come back, we'll discuss immigration policy with Press Secretary Leavitt, who is proving to be surprisingly well prepared. The way he said it got a laugh from the audience, but there was a note of genuine respect in his voice. As the lights dimmed for the commercial break, Jon leaned over. You've done your homework on me, I see. Karoline smiled. I respect you too. Much not to come prepared, Jon. Well, just so you know, we're going to talk about the border situation next, and I'm not going to go easy on you. I wouldn't expect you to, she replied. That wouldn't make for good television. As the makeup artist rushed in again, Karoline could feel the energy in the studio had shifted. The audience wasn't exactly on her side yet, but they were listening, more intently. She had earned their attention, if not their agreement. For now, that was enough. During the commercial break, Karoline took a sip of water from the mug on the small table beside her chair. She could hear the audience members talking among themselves. A young woman in the front row leaned over to her friend and said, She's actually making some good points. The friend nodded reluctantly. Karoline pretended not to hear, but inside she felt a small spark of satisfaction. Jon was huddled with his producer and head writer, Lisa. They were speaking in hushed tones, and Jon kept glancing over at Karoline. She could tell they were rethinking their approach. Good. She wanted them off balance. The floor director counted down with his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The red light on the camera blinked on again. Welcome back, Jon said, his trademark smile firmly in place. We're talking with White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. Let's move on to what might be the most divisive issue in American politics. Today, immigration. He picked up a note card and read from it. Last month, your boss said, we have a crisis at our southern border that threatens the very fabric of our national identity. Critics have called this statement xenophobic and factually misleading. Border crossings are actually down 15% from Their peak 2 years ago. How do you respond? The audience leaned forward. This was the red meat they had been waiting for, a topic guaranteed to create fireworks. Karoline nodded thoughtfully. The statement you quoted refers to the overall trend over the past decade, not just the past 2 years. While it's true that crossings have decreased slightly from their historic high, they're still 340% higher than they were 10 years ago. Jon jumped in. But isn't it misleading to call something a crisis when the numbers are actually improving? Isn't that fear-mongering? I don't think it's fear-mongering to acknowledge reality, Karoline replied calmly. If your house was flooding, and the water went from rising 5 inches per hour to rising 4 inches per hour, would you say the crisis is over? That got a few nods from the audience, which surprised Jon. He hadn't expected his viewers to be receptive to her framing. But the threatening our national identity part, Jon pressed. That's straight out of the nativist playbook, isn't it? America has always been a nation of immigrants. Absolutely, Karoline agreed, which seemed to catch Jon off guard. America is indeed a nation built by immigrants, and legal immigration has been our strength. What my boss was referring to was not immigration itself, but the breakdown of the legal process. When we have hundreds of thousands of people entering the country without going through proper channels, it undermines the rule of law that is central to our national identity. Jon wasn't going to let her off that easily. But many of these people are asylum seekers fleeing violence and persecution. They have a legal right to seek asylum under both U.S. and international law. You're absolutely right, Karoline said again, and there were now confused looks on some audience members' faces. This wasn't going the way they expected. Those with legitimate asylum claims should have their cases heard promptly. The problem is that our system is so overwhelmed that it now takes an average of 4 years to process an asylum case. During that time, people are in limbo, often unable to work legally or access services. That's not humane for them, and it's not sustainable for our communities. She leaned forward slightly. This isn't just my opinion. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has called the current situation untenable and urged comprehensive reforms. Jon looked down at his notes, then back up at Karoline. She could see he was recalibrating his approach. Okay, let's talk about those reforms then. Your administration has proposed some of the strictest immigration measures in decades. Critics say they're cruel and unnecessary. I'd argue they're necessary precisely because we want to be humane, Karoline countered. The current system is failing everyone. It's failing legitimate asylum seekers who wait years for their cases to be heard. It's failing law enforcement who don't have the resources to do their jobs effectively. And it's failing communities that are struggling to integrate large numbers of newcomers without adequate federal support. Jon tried a different angle. But your boss has used language that many find dehumanizing when talking about immigrants. Words matter, don't they? They absolutely do, Karoline agreed. And if specific language has been hurtful, that's something we should address. At the same time, we need to be able to discuss real policy challenges without accusations of bad faith shutting down the conversation before it can even begin. Jon seemed genuinely interested now, rather than just looking for a gotcha moment. So what would a humane but controlled immigration system look like in your view? It would have 3 key elements, Karoline said, holding up her fingers to count them off. First, sufficient resources to process asylum claims quickly, within months, not years. Second, clear and consistent enforcement of our laws at the border and beyond. And third, expanded legal pathways for people who want to come here to work, study, or join family members. She paused, then added, We might disagree on the details of each element, but I think most Americans would support those basic principles. Jon nodded slowly. That's actually a pretty reasonable framework. The audience was silent now, many of them looking confused. This wasn't the heated argument they had expected. It was starting to sound like a productive conversation. Jon seemed to sense their mood. Let me play devil's advocate here, he said, his tone sharpening again. Isn't it true that your administration has drastically cut the number of refugees allowed into the country each year? How does that square with your claim to support legal immigration? That's a fair question, Karoline acknowledged. The refugee cap was lowered temporarily while we reformed the vetting process. But what many people don't know is that we've actually increased the number of skilled worker visas by 25% during the same period. Different programs serve different purposes in our immigration system. Jon checked his notes again. But refugee resettlement organizations say the new vetting procedures are unnecessarily burdensome and have left thousands of people stranded in dangerous situations. Instead of becoming defensive, Karoline pulled out her tablet. I anticipated this might come up, so I brought some data with me. May I show you something? Jon looked surprised again, but nodded. Karoline walked over and showed him her tablet screen. These are the approval rates for refugee applications before and after our reforms. You can see that while processing is taking longer, the approval rate has actually increased from 68% to 72%. We're being more thorough, but ultimately more generous. She turned to make sure the audience could see she was showing Jon actual data, not just making claims. A camera zoomed in on the tablet and the graph appeared on the monitors around the studio. Jon studied it for a moment. I wasn't aware of these figures, he admitted. Why hasn't your office publicized this more widely? That's a fair criticism, Karoline said as she returned to her seat. We need to do a better job of communicating the full picture, not just responding to criticisms. The producer was signaling frantically from offstage. They needed to go to another commercial break, but Jon held up his hand, asking for a moment more. Before we go to break, he said, I have to ask, how did you prepare for this interview? Most guests don't come with charts and graphs and quotes from my past interviews. Karoline smiled. I respect you and your audience too much not to come prepared, Jon. I watched every political interview you've done in the past 5 years. I studied the data on every topic I thought you might raise. And I tried to understand the concerns that your viewers might have rather than just preparing talking points. Jon looked genuinely impressed. Well, it shows. And it makes for a much more interesting conversation. He turned to the camera. We'll be right back with more from White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. As the lights dimmed for the commercial break, murmurs spread through the audience. This was not the interview they had expected to see. Instead of a young press secretary being humiliated by the veteran host, they were watching a substantive discussion between two well-prepared people who disagreed, but seemed to respect each other, and that, Karoline thought to herself, was exactly what she had hoped to achieve. During the commercial break, the studio buzzed with activity. Makeup artists rushed in to touch up both Jon and Karoline. Production assistants hurried back and forth, whispering into headsets. And most notably, the audience members were talking among themselves, many of them looking at Karoline with newfound interest. In the control room, the show's executive producer, Alan, spoke urgently to Jon through his earpiece. This is good television, Jon. Ratings are spiking. Social media is blowing up. People are tuning in to see a takedown, but they're staying for the substance. Keep going with this approach. Jon gave a subtle nod. He had been in this business long enough to know when something was working. He had planned to go hard after Karoline on several more topics, but he was changing his strategy on the fly. A real conversation was proving more compelling than a political blood sport. The floor director counted down again, and they were live. Welcome back, Jon said. If you're just joining us, I'm having a conversation with White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt that has been surprisingly substantive. The audience laughed, but it was a different kind of laughter now, less anticipatory of conflict, more appreciative of the unexpected turn the show had taken. Let's talk about healthcare. Jon continued. Your administration has proposed significant changes to the current system. Critics say these changes would leave millions uninsured. Supporters say they would reduce costs and increase choice. What's your response? Karoline took a sip of water before answering. Healthcare is probably the most complex issue facing our country, and it's one where oversimplification does a disservice to everyone. The reality is that our current system isn't working well for too many Americans. Premiums are too high, deductibles are too high, and many people are effectively uninsured even if they technically have coverage. Jon nodded. That's a point that transcends political lines. but the question is whether your proposed changes would make things better or worse. Our approach focuses on 3 areas, Karoline explained. First, transparency, making sure patients know the real cost of procedures and medications before they receive them. Second, competition, allowing insurance to be sold across state lines to increase options and drive down prices. And third, innovation, reducing regulatory barriers to new treatments and technologies. Jon leaned forward. But what about people with pre-existing conditions? Your boss has been vague about whether your plan would maintain those protections. I can be very clear on that point, Karoline said firmly. Our plan absolutely maintains protections for people with pre-existing conditions. That's non-negotiable. Where we differ from the current approach is in how we structure the market to make those protections financially sustainable over the long term. A young man in the audience raised his hand. This was unusual. Audience participation wasn't typically part of the format. Jon looked surprised but nodded to him. Go ahead, Jon said, curious about what would happen. I have a question for Ms. Leavitt, the young man said. He looked to be in his early 30s, wearing a plaid shirt and glasses. I have a chronic health condition, and I'm worried about losing my coverage. Can you explain specifically how your plan would affect someone like me? The show's producer looked alarmed. This was completely off script. But Jon seemed intrigued and gestured for Karoline to answer. That's an important question, Karoline said, turning to face the man directly. Under our plan, insurance companies would still be prohibited from denying you coverage or charging you more based on your condition. The difference would be in how we structure the risk pools and subsidies to make that economically viable without driving up premiums for everyone else, she continued. We would create specialized high-risk pools with direct government subsidies, rather than forcing insurance companies to spread the cost across all policyholders. Our analysis suggests this would lower premiums for the majority, while ensuring people with chronic conditions still have affordable options. The young man nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for the clear answer. Jon looked around the studio. Something remarkable was happening. The audience, which had come expecting entertainment in the form of political combat, was now engaged in a serious policy discussion. He decided to go with it. Does anyone else have a question? He asked. Several hands went up. Jon pointed to a middle-aged woman near the back. My question is about education, she said. Your administration has proposed significant cuts to federal education programs. How does that help our children? Karoline turned to face her. What's often lost in the headlines about budget cuts is that we're not reducing overall education funding. We're shifting it from federal administrative programs to direct block grants to states and school districts. The same money is going into education, but with fewer layers of bureaucracy in between. Another audience member, an older man with gray hair, spoke up without being called on. But states might use that money for other things if it's not specifically earmarked. That's a legitimate concern, Karoline acknowledged. Our plan includes accountability measures that require states to demonstrate improved outcomes to continue receiving the same level of funding. We believe that local educators and parents know better than Washington bureaucrats what their specific schools need, but we also believe in measuring results. Jon watched this exchange with a mixture of surprise and admiration. The show had spontaneously transformed into something like a town hall, with Karoline fielding questions directly from the audience, and she was handling it remarkably well. I have to say, Jon interjected, this isn't how I expected this interview to go. I thought we'd be trading barbs and gotcha moments, but instead, we're having a substantive policy discussion. Karoline smiled. Isn't that better? It is, Jon agreed, though possibly less entertaining for viewers who tuned in hoping to see political blood sport. I think you underestimate your audience, Jon, Karoline said. People are hungry for real conversations about the issues that affect their lives. They're tired of the shouting and the sound bites. As if to prove her point, another audience member spoke up. A young woman with brightly colored hair who looked like the last person you'd expect to be sympathetic to Karoline's politics. I don't agree with a lot of your policies, the young woman said bluntly. But I appreciate that you're actually explaining them instead of just attacking the other side. Why don't we see more of this kind of communication from your administration? This was a tough question, perhaps the toughest of the night. The studio went quiet as everyone waited for Karoline's response. That's a fair criticism, Karoline said after a moment. In the daily rush of responding to crises and criticisms, we sometimes forget to take the time to explain the reasoning behind our decisions. The press briefings become more about defending positions than explaining them. That's something I need to work on personally. The honesty of her answer seemed to resonate with the audience. Even Jon looked impressed. We need to take our final break, he said, checking his watch. But when we come back, I want to continue this conversation. And I have to say, Ms. Leavitt, you've given me a lot to think about. As the lights dimmed for the commercial, the studio remained buzzing with conversation. The audience members were talking to each other across the aisles, discussing the points Karoline had made. The producers were huddled trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected format change for the final segment, and Karoline sat quietly, taking it all in. She had come prepared for battle but found something more valuable, a chance to be heard, really heard, by people who had been predisposed to dismiss her. Whatever happened in the final segment, she had already accomplished something important. When the cameras began rolling again for the final segment, the energy in the studio was completely different from when the interview had started. The audience sat forward in their seats, fully engaged. The show's crew members had stopped their side conversations to watch. Even the usually unflappable Jon Stewart seemed energized by the unexpected turn the show had taken. Welcome back to our conversation with White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, Jon said. I think it's fair to say this interview hasn't gone the way anyone expected, myself included. The audience laughed, and several people nodded in agreement. For this final segment, Jon continued, I'd like to try something different. Instead of me asking gotcha questions or trying to score political points, let's have an honest conversation about the state of political dialogue in America. He turned to Karoline. You mentioned earlier that people are tired of shouting and sound bites. Do you really believe that? Because your boss has certainly contributed his share of inflammatory rhetoric to our national conversation. It was a fair question, and potentially a trap. Karoline could either criticize her boss, which would make headlines but damage her professionally, or defend behavior that many Americans found troubling. You're right that our political discourse has become too heated on all sides, Karoline said carefully. And yes, that includes statements from my boss that I wish had been phrased differently. I don't think any single person or party is solely responsible for where we are now. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I think we've all played a role in creating a system where outrage gets more attention than nuance. That includes politicians, media, and yes, even voters who reward the loudest voices with their attention and support. Jon nodded thoughtfully. That's a refreshingly honest answer. But do you think it's possible to change that system? Because right now it seems like a race to the bottom. I believe it is possible, Karoline said. What's happening right here, right now, is proof of that. You invited me on your show expecting one kind of segment, and your audience tuned in expecting to see you, frankly, make me look foolish. The audience laughed nervously, knowing she was right. Instead, we've had a substantive conversation where we've disagreed on policy but treated each other with respect. And look at the response. She gestured to the engaged audience. People are interested, they're listening. A middle-aged woman in the audience spoke up without being called on. I came here tonight because I love Jon, and I wanted to see him take down someone from an administration I didn't vote for. But I've actually learned something from listening to you, even though I still don't agree with most of your policies. Several people around her nodded in agreement. Jon turned to the woman. What changed for you during this interview? The woman thought for a moment. I guess I realized that I've been dismissing the other side without really listening to their reasoning. It's easy to assume that people who disagree with you are either stupid or evil. It's harder to engage with their actual arguments. That's exactly it, Karoline said. And it goes both ways. People in my party also need to do a better job of listening rather than dismissing. Jon turned back to Karoline. But how do we get there from here? The incentives all seem to push in the wrong direction. Cable news, social media, campaign fundraising, they all reward the most extreme voices. I don't have a perfect answer, Karoline admitted, but I think it starts with individual choices. As public figures, we can choose to explain rather than attack. As citizens, we can reward substance over spectacle with our attention and support. An older man in the audience raised his hand, and Jon nodded to him. I've been voting for 50 years, the man said, his voice carrying wisdom and a touch of sadness, and I've never seen the country this divided. Do you really think we can find common ground again? Karoline turned to face him directly. Sir, I believe we already have common ground. Most Americans want the same basic things: security, opportunity, dignity, a better future for their children. We disagree, sometimes passionately, about how to achieve those things. But the goals themselves? We share those, she continued. The problem is that we've come to see policy disagreements as moral failings. If you support a different tax plan than I do, it must be because you're greedy or naive. If you have a different approach to immigration, it must be because you're heartless or reckless. Once we start attributing the worst possible motives to those who disagree with us, conversation becomes impossible. Jon was watching her with genuine interest now. So how do we get past that tendency to demonize the other side? By doing exactly what we're doing now, Karoline said. Having conversations where we focus on ideas rather than attacks. Explaining our reasoning rather than just stating our conclusions. And perhaps most importantly, acknowledging when the other side makes a good point. Jon smiled. Like you did earlier when you agreed with me about the importance of protecting those with pre-existing conditions? Exactly, Karoline nodded. And like you did when you acknowledged that some of my policy explanations were reasonable, even though you might still disagree with the approach. The floor director was signaling that they were running out of time. Jon noticed and nodded. We're almost out of time, he said. But before we go, I want to ask you one last question, Karoline. What's one thing you wish Americans on the left understood about your administration that you think they've misinterpreted? Karoline thought for a moment. I wish they understood that disagreeing on policy doesn't mean we don't share the same goals. We all want a prosperous, fair, and free America. We have different ideas about how to get there, and those differences matter. But attributing bad faith to those who disagree with you makes progress impossible. Jon nodded. That's a fair point, and I hope that conversations like this one can help bridge some of those divides. He turned to the camera. That's all the time we have tonight. I want to thank White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt for joining us for what turned out to be a surprisingly substantive conversation. The audience applauded, and this time it wasn't the polite, reserved applause from the beginning of the show. It was enthusiastic and genuine. As the credits began to roll, Jon turned to Karoline. Thank you for coming on the show. This wasn't what I expected, but I think it was actually more valuable. Thank you for being open to a real conversation, Karoline replied. I know it would have been easier to go for the laughs. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the stage, several audience members approached her. Some wanted to ask additional questions. Others simply wanted to thank her for her candor. A young woman who had been sitting in the front row came up to her. I still disagree with most of your policies, the young woman said, but I'll be listening more carefully in the future, instead of just dismissing everything your administration says. That's something, isn't it? Karoline smiled. That's everything, actually. Outside the studio, Karoline's phone was buzzing constantly, with messages. Her boss had watched the interview and was thrilled with her performance. Political commentators were already analyzing the unexpected dynamic between her and Jon. Social media was lighting up with clips from the show, many of them accompanied by surprised comments about how substantive the discussion had been. But, as she got into her car to head back to her hotel, what Karoline thought about wasn't the political implications or the positive coverage. She thought about that young woman in the audience, and her promise to listen more carefully in the future. If she had accomplished nothing else tonight, that alone made it worthwhile. Sometimes turning the tables meant something different than what people expected. It wasn't about defeating your opponent. It was about changing the game entirely.